Hear these words from Genesis chapter 37, verses 2 through 4. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. This is the word of the Lord. This chapter begins the story of Joseph going into Egypt, and with two exceptions, the rest of the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph. The migration into Egypt was prophesied in Genesis 15, 13 through 16, so we're not surprised when this happens. As you will soon see, the story of Joseph is different from the other historical narratives in Genesis. God does not appear directly to Joseph, nor do the angels. Rather, God works in secret, hidden ways through unexpected people. The story is lengthy, with more detail and a deeper plot line through several chapters. And we'll notice a significant shift in geography from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt. The chapter begins with the sentences, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Most scholars believe that this is actually the ending statement for chapter 36 and was simply divided incorrectly by translators. So our story begins with the statement, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. This story reminds me of a pattern of writing and poetry that I have seen called Fortunately and Unfortunately. The pattern holds up throughout this chapter and even into the rest of the story. Let's hear the story with the unfortunately and fortunately pattern with the help of a narrator. Fortunately, Joseph was a young man and he had an internship tending sheep with his half-brothers. Unfortunately, Joseph was prone to tattling on his brothers and went to his father with complaints about them. And now we hear from the narrator. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. Was this love based on the fact that Joseph was Rachel's son? Had Jacob become wiser over the years and treated this son differently than his older sons? We don't know all of Jacob's motivations, but something caused him to treat Joseph differently. Joseph received a beautiful coat, one that was not a work garment, but a fine garment employing royalty. Did Jacob know already that Joseph was going to be the son of promise, since Reuben, Simeon, and Levi were all disqualified due to sinful actions? For whatever reason, Jacob favored Joseph over the others, and the hatred between Joseph and his brothers grew until they could not speak a kind word to him. Think about that for a moment. What kind of household environment did that create for this family? Fortunately, Joseph had a dream. God often communicated his will through dreams and visions, and the people of the ancient Near East recognized dreams as a valid source of revelation from the gods. So there was some assumed authority to this dream. Unfortunately, it did not bode well for Joseph's relationships with his brothers. The dream involved all of them binding sheaves of grain out in the field, and suddenly Joseph's sheaf arose and stood upright. The other sheaves gathered around that one and bowed down to it. This was exactly the implication of Joseph's coat, and it was like rubbing salt into the already injured relationship between Joseph and his brothers. Fortunately, Joseph had another dream. The sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to him. Unfortunately, it bore a similar message to the first dream. Also, Joseph told his father and his brothers. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this incident and its meaning in his mind and heart. Narrator: these two dreams are timely, and they do bring a message from God. We see after the fact that the dreams foreshadow the events that come later. We are reminded that God is in control of history, and his plan will unfold in God's good time. Interestingly, Joseph's very act of telling the brothers of the dreams sets them against him even more deeply. This will be part of what implements God's plan to get Joseph to Egypt and eventually into a place where he can be an instrument of salvation for God's people. Joseph is not the key figure in this story. God is. Joseph's story reveals God's eternal redemptive plan to use Joseph's situation and his character for God's purposes. Israel will be saved by Yahweh, not Joseph. Fortunately, in the next part of the story, Joseph's brothers had taken the flocks to graze them near Shechem, which may well have relieved the tension in the household for a bit of the time. Unfortunately, Jacob sent Joseph to find them and to see if all was going well with them. If this were a movie, the development music for this part would definitely carry some suspenseful overtones. Joseph headed out to find his brothers, and when he got to Shechem, he was wandering around in the fields looking for them. Fortunately, a man found him wandering in the fields and asked who he was looking for. The man knew of Joseph's brothers and had heard them say where they were going next. So Joseph headed for Dothan. Narrator: this is a God sighting. Maybe not an angel, certainly not the appearance of God, but a timely appearance, a God incidence. This is the way God shows up in Joseph's story. When has God shown up for you like this? Unfortunately, as Joseph headed for his brothers and found them near Dothan, they saw him coming and plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to one another. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him." Fortunately, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben had a plan to come back and rescue him and take him back to his father. Unfortunately, when Joseph reached his brothers, they carried out their plans to dispose of him in the cistern. They took off his coat, that richly ornamented coat he was wearing, and they threw him in the cistern. Fortunately, this cistern was empty of water. There may have been snakes, scorpions, or spiders, but no water. Here the story's pace quickens, and it's a mix of up and downs. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, they slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Fortunately for Joseph, for Israel, and even for us, the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So you've heard a retelling of a fairly familiar story. How does this story connect with your story, with my story? At the beginning of my sharing, I mentioned some characteristics of this story. God does not appear directly to Joseph, nor do the angels. Rather, God works in secret, hidden ways through unexpected people. The story is lengthy, with more detail and a deeper plot line through several chapters. And there is a significant shift in geography in the unfolding of this story. Come to think of it, God still works in these ways for ordinary people to bring great stories of redemption to light and to life. I'm reminded of the many chapters in my life, the way Brian and I met, our decision to move to Santa Barbara for university, which brought us also to the Methodist Church. Brian's call to ministry, which came through so many regular people, underscoring the fact that God works in secret, hidden ways through unexpected people. Our move to Wilmore, Kentucky was a bittersweet moment that would fit the pattern well. Fortunately, we finally decided on a seminary. Unfortunately, or so I thought at the time, it was in Wilmore, Kentucky, 2,000 miles away from the West Coast, in a foreign land. Like Joseph, my story does involve some significant shifts in geography. How about yours? From Kentucky, we returned to California, and Brian served 6 years in San Jacinto, 45 miles west of Palm Springs. There were many things to learn in Southern California, and after 6 years, fortunately, God moved us back to Oregon, to Banks. After 15 years to Beaverton, one more church for Brian to serve until he retired from local church ministry in 2020. At this point, I will simply say the story is lengthy, with more detail and a deeper plot line through several chapters. Through all of this, God did not appear directly to either one of us, but he spoke through other people, some of whom were as unknown to us as the stranger in the field who spoke to Joseph about the whereabouts of his brothers. Some were dear friends, fellow disciples in the Lord, who listened, who prayed, who shared their wisdom with us. Sometimes we read stories in Scripture and think, well, God must not be invested in my life. Nothing ever happens to me the way it happened with Abraham or Sarah, David, Peter, and many heroes of the Christian faith. But here today we learn that God works literally in mysterious ways through a variety of people and circumstances, in the stories of daily life unfolding one day, one instance at a time. He works through and in broken relationships and sadness and grief. He works around the lies and the sins of people, and he works to bring his redemptive story forward, even when it looks like the unfortunately chapters are going to win out over the ones we term as the fortunately ones. What has come to mind today when you have heard this familiar story again? How is your life unfolding? Where do you see God at work? How has God used others in your life, in the places you have lived, the neighbors you have had, the work you have done, to bring you to a place where you can listen to him more deeply and walk out your faith more clearly? Some of the story fits very clearly into the unfortunately category. Sometimes the fortunately stories are short-lived before more of the other kind come flooding on. Sometimes it all moves so fast we can't even tell the difference. May we see God's handprints along the way and trust that he is holding us all along the journey. Amen.